We serve a cosmic, complex, beautiful God that made the diversity. I didn't even understand what atoms were until I graduated high school. Like, for crying out loud, there are things I don't know, especially about the complex, beautiful, complicated person right in front of me, and me too. So if we understand how important humility is, then we have to start letting go of that need to control, that need for power. And again, that's where the vulnerability of trust comes in. That is just so difficult to really step into, especially when we're afraid.
Welcome to 3%. We're your hosts, Jamie Haig.
And I'm Blake Roberts.
We're two best friends, fathers, husbands, and just two guys trying to figure it out.
We're also therapists, which is probably a pretty important part.
That's true.
And we believe that at our best, people are 97% honest with themselves and others, and it's that hidden 3% of emotions, needs, desires, and behaviors that we keep to ourselves that keep us bound to shame and loneliness, from which many of our issues stem.
Each week on this podcast, we'll interview leaders in the fields of psychology, theology, arts, and athletics to explore holistic masculinity. We're not here to tell you the man you need to be, but we are here to help you explore what gets in the way of being the man you want to be.
We're going to help you develop courage and give you the tools to share your 3% in the relationships that matter most, so you can more deeply connect with yourself, God, and others. So, pull up a chair.
Let's get into it.
So let's be honest, let's be honest, let's be honest, let's be honest.
Well, hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of 3%. We have an awesome episode for you today. We get to talk to Ben Cremer today on the podcast. You may know Ben if you have been on social media anytime, especially in the last year. I know even in my own family, he's been quite an encouragement to a number of my family members through his writing both online and in the newsletter Into the Gray. Ben is a pastor. He's been in ministry since 2005. He is a father, a husband, married to his wife Rebecca since 2020, and he has two kids with one on the way. So Ben is doing a lot of things right now. He's also an author. You finished your first manuscript this year, right, Ben?
Yeah, we're doing the finishing touches on it. We pushed the deadline back, so it won't be published when I thought it would be. So the last submission will be around November, and hoping for spring of 2026 or 2027. So we'll see.
That's so exciting. A book,
Wow.
man.
Yeah.
That's Blake and I both hope to do that one of these days. So Ben, we're just so thankful to have you here, and would love to hear anything else that you would say people should know about you before we get to know you more.
Oh yeah, well, first I want to say how much I appreciate you guys, and just the honor of having another conversation with you, especially given all of the distance between us. I just feel this camaraderie and kinship with you guys, our posture towards the world. And it seems so rare, as interconnected as we are, it seems so rare to be able to have conversations like this. So really appreciate the work you guys are doing. I think maybe just to add context, was born and raised in Idaho, and those of you who know anything about Idaho's culture and context, you can kind of imagine what pastoral ministry is like in the Idaho area. And I've only lived outside of Idaho for about 3 years, so the majority of my life and my work is kind of reflective of life and ministry in a place like Idaho, but is always an ongoing conversation with the culture that a place like Idaho would bring.
Yeah.
What's to give somebody an idea, or maybe me, because I don't know much, what is the culture? I think the only thing I know about Idaho is is it the famous potato famine? Was that in Idaho?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We have
That's all
famous
I know about
potatoes
Idaho.
on
I'm
our
sorry.
license. Yeah. We supply, if you have McDonald's French fries, odds are it's a Idaho potato. But
Straight from
maybe
the farm,
a little
not
bit
even
of history.
processed.
Exactly. Yeah, just fresh cut from the farm. So Idaho has an interesting history. Right before the Civil War was ending, a lot of Confederate soldiers kind of escaped to Idaho and planted one of the first major cities, Silver City. And they became such a dominant force here that right after um, uh, the surrender of the Civil War, Lincoln came and established Fort Boise just to have a Union presence because Confederacy had started overtaking the place. So they were trying to have a white dominant agricultural limited government state. And you can kind of see that legacy carried out throughout all of Idaho in how, we are a hardworking people, rugged individualists. And so there's a lot of great qualities for like people who have called Idaho home their whole life. But there are some really, really negative aspects too. We have per capita the majority of like white supremacist groups because of our topography. People can kind of hide out in mountains and like have compounds and things like that. And so our panhandle has been home to some just not so great groups and things like that too. So that shapes our culture, but we've been like 98% white for 30, 40 years. And so that lack of diversity also impacts our culture too. And so there's just a lot with that in regards to how we define, gender norms and all of Christianity. A lot of those things go into that kind of cultural makeup.
Yeah. Could you speak more to your background in ministry and how you've ended up where you are now, which is writing pretty independently?
Yeah, absolutely. So my parents moved from California to Idaho for my dad's job. And just because they were trying to find community, they unwittingly found themselves in a kind of white separatist homeschool co-op group. And once Ruby Ridge happened, which, as your listeners probably know, was the standoff with the federal government in 1992 in Ruby Ridge, Idaho. And the scales kind of fell from my parents' eyes and like, oh, this homeschool co-op they're white separatists because of all the things that they were saying. And so they left that group, and that was part of, non-denominational kind of Pentecostal evangelical church. We went through some really difficult spiritual manipulation from the pastors, lots of church splits and things like that. And so had a really unhealthy church experience. But in the midst of that, felt called to be a pastor at around 7 years old and couldn't really ever shake it. I fought and wrestled with it because I didn't have a good church experience. I'm like, this is the last thing I want to do, but I couldn't shake that call. Took a year off between high school and college and really wrestled with God about that and stumbled upon Wesley's sermons of grace. And I thought, you know what, if I could really hone in on that idea of grace that I'm seeing in the Gospels, I can maybe do this. And so pursued my theological education through Northwest Nazarene University, and then went to seminary in Kansas City, and was ordained in 2016. I was licensed officially in 2005, which I kind of peg as the beginning of my ministry with youth and young adults, and then pastored a church here in Boise for 8 years. And by the time, right around the time I met and married my wife, Rebecca, my public writing, just trying to pastor people through the political landscape that seemed to be becoming more and more extreme as the days went by, especially in regards to Christianity and politics. I felt this yearning and this call to really help people pastorally navigate a lot of these issues we were facing, and just to give them theological language to articulate their own faith in their own context. And that unfortunately led to the powers that be in the Nazarene denomination to start pushing me out, close down opportunities, seeing me really as more of a threat than a partner. And that really broke my heart, because that's where I really found my theological education, my voice, all of these things. So to be pushed out from what I counted as my Christian family was probably the most painful experience of my ministry, and I still feel that way.
Yeah.
And so then in Easter of 2020, I left. I think it was 2020 or 2021. I'm kind of fuzzy
Yeah.
on that right now, but
Yeah.
left the denomination. They took my credentials away, and the United Methodist Church really brought me in. Like, they heard about what was happening and they brought me in. Felt pretty rescued because I didn't know what was going to happen, but they brought me in, and I spent 2 years of full-time ministry with the UMC, and I still count the UMC as my church home. But then just financial realities, I couldn't afford to support my kids in childcare and my pastoral salary. My wife works full-time as well. And God really opened the door to a lot of online pastoral ministry. And I feel like I'm discipling and helping a lot of people through an online ministry. And so I just took a leap of faith and followed God into writing and preaching and doing discipleship online full time. And that's kind of where I find myself right now. I still really miss pastoral ministry. There's nothing like living life with a local congregation. And so I really hope to move that way again when the Lord allows, but I'm just trying to live fully into the opportunities that God's brought about so far.
Yeah. Man, I cannot imagine the pain of attempting to care for people well and love on people well, and then ultimately that leading to your denomination saying you need to not be here. Like, you're trying to be the hands and feet of Jesus and you're told you're a problem.
Yeah, it took a lot of, really good therapy and processing to get to the point of articulating what I was feeling. And it really was this sense of betrayal. It felt like they were choosing public optics or metrics over one of their own pastors. And unfortunately, I was number 32 just in my friends group that was happening to simultaneously that year, being pushed out of the denomination, just in my own friends group that went to seminary, went through theological education. And so it wasn't just happening to me. And that was, I think, added to the heartbreak, as I saw people I just admired and respected in professors and pastors just being pushed out for very similar reasons. So it was just, it was really devastating.
Yeah. Well, we're glad that you do what you do now. And I think what you are doing now is so important. Like you said, you're pastoring to many people online, and you very humbly said that you think you are helping a lot of people. You are helping so many people, Ben.
I appreciate that.
I think it's a natural time to transition to talk more about that. But we forgot to prep you for this, so heads up. But something that we've been doing for everybody listening, we got to talk to Ben. It was last year.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the first three.
Wow.
And so we were really excited about it. And I tried probably 4 or 5 different ways to edit that podcast to make it work. And we just couldn't do it. And so for everybody listening, to understand the humility and kindness of Ben, all you need to know is he's coming on here again a second time before we've ever released anything with him. He's just such a generous dude. But something that we've started doing, Ben, since we talked to you, is we've started asking at the beginning of the podcast, what does holistically masculine mean to you?
Wow.
And so we would love to, unprepped, get your initial thoughts on what holistically masculine means to you.
Wow. Gosh, no pondering time at all. Just hearing you phrase that question, you can feel the weight of it, like the importance of it, right? Like, that is such an important question for our time. And my first thought is Jesus. I mean, not to sound overly, pastoral, but like when I was growing up, I remember all of the kind of role models I was given just by Christian culture alone of what masculinity looked like. And it was John Wayne was a big influence, a lot of Westerns, but even in the Bible, it was figures like King David and Samson, these figures that fit this kind of stereotypical idea of what leadership looks like or what strength looks like. And I got to the point where I was really struggling with a lot of these expectations of what being a man meant, because I was more emotionally sensitive as a kid. I preferred like fishing and music and reading and writing to like hunting, and shooting was a huge, you grow up in Idaho, you're given a gun at birth. So you kind of have to, guns are just, a huge part of that. And it's tied very much so to the definition of manhood, like knowing how to handle a gun, having no problem with violence. Like that was just ingrained in the culture that I grew up in, and very tied to what Christianity meant to me as well. And so when I was in seminary, I just remember sitting in the library one day and just like breaking down and just like reading about Jesus riding a donkey into Jerusalem unarmed with a group of fishermen and tax collectors and women and children, and like the stark contrast of him, like, and I thought that was such a powerful moment. Like that was true strength, walking into Jerusalem with hostile people everywhere who were against him, and just saying, I am going to commit to nonviolence, to peace, to practice what I've been preaching my whole life up to that moment. And that contrast of thinking this would not be accepted as masculine compared to the culture that I was raised in. This would not be seen as strength. It would be seen as weakness. And so my question is like, why isn't Jesus a role model? Like, why wasn't he the role model of robust, holistic masculinity for me in the Christian culture that I was raised in? Yeah. And I think the answer is a really heartbreaking one, is that who Jesus is in the Gospels, elevating women, advocating for equality, including the excluded, loving enemies rather than fighting them and choosing violence. Those things are not equated to strength or true leadership in a lot of the stereotypical definitions of masculinity that we see. I think the holistic view that I've come to of masculinity would be who we see Jesus embody and emulate in the Gospels.
Yeah, and this is something that we're pretty passionate about in 3%. It's not even to say that guns are wrong or being one of these more traditional masculine style guys is wrong, hunting, whatever.
Exactly, yeah.
It's to say that when you use that in a place of dominance and control of others, without integrating the space to emulate Jesus, if you can't be like Jesus and those things, then you may be missing the mark.
That is so well said. And I think, because I have friends who fit that, very traditional role of masculinity, but they don't make it feel like that's the only way that you can be a man, right?
Yeah.
And that ability to respect and admire how someone is masculine, how they show up as a man, and you can see these different characteristics of Jesus in the midst of that, I think is such a beautiful diversity of what that can mean that's often stifled when it says this is the only way you can be a man, and it's this hyper, aggressive, violent picture that I was given mostly.
Yeah, because even if you look at David growing up, I don't know for you, what was not emphasized for me necessarily was that at David's weakest as a child, he showed his greatest feat of strength. And that at David's greatest, in terms of what he believed his own strength was, he had his greatest failing in murdering a man to take his wife.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily what was emphasized about David to me. It was like, here's the picture of strength. And I think that shows, when you look at it like that, it's like, here's the picture of who God is. At David's weakest, God shows his strength.
Yeah.
And at David's, probably what I can imply, now I'm not the pastor, you're the pastor. What I can imply is that at David's most conceited, he had his greatest failing of pride, which was to steal someone who did not belong to him in order to assert dominance and control.
Yep.
Yeah.
And what was also not emphasized for me either was really being held accountable by another man like Nathan, who he wasn't emphasized as used by God as kind of the hero of the text, who, prophets risked their lives when they rebuked kings, who had all the power to say, oh, get this guy out of here and end his life because of what he just said to me, right? So Nathan comes in utter humility, putting his life on the line to speak truth to power in the midst of David's most, public, and it was rooftops, like public sin that everyone else knew that David seemed to be not admitting or acknowledging or reckoning with. And for Nathan to come in and love him enough to hold him accountable and rebuke him, like that wasn't ever, like I had to wait till, why did I have to wait till seminary to learn about that?
Yeah.
That's what it looked like for men to hold each other accountable too. That would have been deeply formative for me.
Yeah, and that God's heart for David was to care for him through a rebuke. Yeah, that's part of masculinity.
Ben, are you familiar with Chuck DeGroat?
No, I don't think so.
Oh man, well, we had him on the show. He's a pastor, therapist.
He leads the clinical mental health department at Northwestern Theological.
Oh,
Center.
wow.
Something with Western in it. Anyways, you would love his work. He's author. He's written a lot of books. I'm surprised you haven't heard of him, because he wrote a book called When Narcissism Comes to Church. That was kind of one of his.
Oh, I have heard of that book. Oh,
yeah.
my
Okay.
goodness.
So this is Chuck. He's kind of like who I want to be when I get older.
Me too.
And as we're talking about this,
Yeah.
as we're talking, we had him on, and he wrote a new book that we talked about, which was amazing. But he posted this thing earlier. He was at this men's retreat in I can't remember where it was, but they were gardening at this men's retreat, and he kind of contrasted this with, I've been to all of the men's retreats where, we go axe throwing and play paintball, and he said, but what if, and I just have to read it because it's right in line with what we're talking about. He said, what if we're not called to be the guardians and the gladiators? What if we are gardeners? And he says, tending gently to our unspoken wounds, listening for the longings we've buried, caring for weary bodies and parched souls. What if growth comes not by force, but by letting go? In an age obsessed with performative ripening, maybe we're being called back to slow growth, to deep roots, to the kind of strength that heals instead of hides. And I was like, already like, wow. Oh my goodness, Chuck. And then I was this is a Facebook post, probably an excerpt from his book, I don't know. But then I was reading through the comments, and somebody said, a few months ago, I began reading the Gospels, taking note of when the language of cultivation versus warfare was used. So far, it's about 10-1 on the side of cultivation.
Oh my gosh.
Right? And that's so opposite. That's so opposite of so much of the narrative around Christianity today and our masculinity today. Those are kind of the two themes that we're talking about. But yeah, like the idea of cultivating my own soul as a garden to be tended to versus this internal war that I have of parts of me that I need to fight off, which then turns me into this warrior that fights other people that may not align with the way I think it should be, is like, come on.
Oh my goodness. Man, that just like reminded me, I mean, what do the prophets say about our spears being hammered down into pruning hooks and our swords into plowshares. Like these are gardening, our weapons are being transformed into gardening tools. And all four gospels show Jesus resurrecting where? In that garden. And he's even mistaken as the gardener by Mary. And it's this incredibly, it's an apocalyptic image of how God's intention in the garden, the first garden, Genesis, was to tend and work the garden. That was God's first command to humanity, together in harmony and in brilliance. And for Jesus to then meet a woman all four times in the Gospels after he's resurrected, the first fruits of life out of self-sacrificial love, that future is made available through that sacrifice, not through weapons of war, but through the cultivation of love in a garden between the full image of God together, male and female, just in brilliant harmony with each other. And like that, I feel like that Facebook post is just scripture, like a paraphrase of that, scriptural theme. It's just so powerful.
Okay, well then you're such a pastor, by the way. I love it. I
Same.
I mean that sincerely.
Same.
It just flows out of you. But here's the big question then. Are you ready?
Wait, the first one wasn't the big question?
No,
like
that was this. Oh no, this is the second big question. So everything that I just read from Chuck and then what you then said, why don't we get it?
Oh man. Right? Like that. So I had a pastor, he would jokingly say that, like, if we're not reading the Gospels, as Americans, if we're not reading the Gospels, understanding that we have more in common with the Romans than we do first century Israelites or Palestinians, then we're reading it wrong. Like that,
I've never heard that.
You're gonna read it. So like we are one of the wealthiest, most like powerful countries in the world, and they were the religious elites, right? So if we're not reading it as if we have more in common with the Romans, we're gonna read it wrong off the get-go. But second, he would jokingly say that if we don't read it as the disciples who are with Jesus in the flesh, seeing miracles, witnessing minds transformed, and even still, like after the resurrection, Acts 1, their first question to him is, are you now going to make Israel great again? Like, are you now going to restore Israel? And Jesus is like, man, just go wait for the Holy Spirit. Sit down, close your mouths, and wait for the Holy Spirit. And it was the birth of the church, right? All nations, all flesh. God's Spirit is poured out on everyone, like rich, poor, just a beautiful picture of God's desire, reversing the Tower of Babel, bringing everyone together, being heard and understood in the midst of their uniqueness and diversity. It's just powerful. But the disciples are walking with him in the flesh and still don't seem to understand. After the resurrection, a lot of them do seem to get it. Like, oh my gosh, like all of these things I understand now, given the light and the revelation of the resurrection. But I think so much of why we don't get it, and I think this calls for grace, honestly, is that we get scared. Because, like, I can't, especially as a pastor, I can't help but hear a lot of the most harmful narratives, harmful policies, harmful practices from the church. You can't dig down too far before encountering fear. And I in studying Judas, like, he's an interesting case of fear, because some scholars would suggest that given his political affiliations at the time, his actions weren't that he denied that Jesus was the Messiah. It's that he believed it so deeply that he thought betrayal would force his hand to call down legions of angels and wipe out the Romans, because that's what this is a theory, right? Because we don't have a lot of hard stance as to why, but given his political affiliations, it can make sense that that's why he had so much remorse after the fact, because he realized he handed over and betrayed a truly innocent man. And that to me really illustrates how people can be so convicted that they're doing the right thing. Like, this is going to bring freedom for people. This is going to bring, the best possible future for my family or my kids, and just approach the worst possible outcomes under that belief. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we don't get it. And Peter is another good example where he rebuked Jesus, saying, like, Jesus is predicting his death. Well, you can't overthrow Rome with a dead Messiah. So Peter's like, he takes him to the side and like, heck, you're going to do that. Like, that's not what you're going to do, Jesus. And Jesus calls him, "Get thee behind me, Satan," because Peter is essentially tempting Jesus the same way Satan did in the wilderness, with the power over all earthly kingdoms. And Jesus is saying, you don't have the things of God in mind. You have the things of the world in mind. You're still operating under that definition of power. And so the life of the disciple is so complicated, but I think that's why fear is addressed so often, that we must begin with humility and trust, so that we are always open to learning the ways in which we might have this thing wrong, the ways in which we're pursuing Jesus wrong, or understanding ourselves wrong, that it really comes down to humility and letting love drive away that fear so that we can take steps of integrity.
Humility is so vulnerable.
It is so vulnerable.
Yeah. I think even to get to, for the listener, please go read Into the Gray, the entire, well, it'll take you a minute to get through the entirety of it, but just go and read, and I think you'll find some encouragement and nourishment there. But the one from this week that we thought was so timely that Ben released is, "Do not repay extreme binary thinking with extreme binary thinking." And it's what we're talking about right here. Fear without humility leads to, well, in that, theory of Judas, it's like there were only two options. There was either he gives Jesus over or convinces Jesus to come in with power, or there was a lack of control for him. Like that's the binary thinking. And I think we see that modeled in the way that people interact with faith and politics today, which you write a lot really eloquently about. And I think what I want to direct us towards in terms of this conversation for our listeners is, how do we get to more of this cultivation model that Blake is talking about, this humility? How do we approach non-extreme binary thinking so that we can hold someone's opinion and our own opinion, even if they're incredibly contrasting, but we don't forget the space of being more like Jesus in between, where we can care for them?
That's, again, you articulate questions so well.
He must be a therapist.
I think where I start, he must be, yeah. That's why I feel so good after talking to you guys. Just, yeah, that's why. Where my mind goes, and this is where my kind of the central theme of where I want my book to be. It's a work in progress, so we'll see where it arrives, but it's really the incarnation, that God, I'm just still just in awe and struck by God choosing to become a human being. Like, that was the first step in the way of salvation, of bringing about salvation to the world. God didn't become a set of rigid dogma, didn't become a set of beliefs that people had to conform to, didn't even become a set of holy scriptures. God saw the human person, even in the vulnerable form of an infant, as coming in the world, and that's the first way that God would save the world. Like, sort of humility. And Paul says it so well in Philippians 2, that although Jesus saw equality with God as something to be He didn't see that equality with God as something to be exploited, even though he was equal with God. But he lowered himself, took the form of a human being, and even to the point of death on a cross, he would go that low for our behalf. So if God sees humanity as worthy enough to become one of us, then how then do we step into another person's world? And the hardest ones, of course, are the ones that we disagree with, that we see as opponents, right? How do we, though, how can we step outside of ourselves just enough to say, okay, I'm not invalidating all the things I disagree with. Like, those things I can set to the side. I'm not invalidating them by doing that. But what ways can I step into their world and at least hear why? Like, why are they advocating the opinions that way? And once you can get to stepping into their world and they see you doing that out of love, more often than not, it's not always like a quick fix or 100% guarantee that everything's going to be better after that. But taking that step of vulnerability, humility ourselves, just as God did, becoming human, into another person's world, it brings about, more often than not, it brings about at least a place of commonality for future healthy, cultivating conversations to take place than what we see on Facebook often, where it's just like opinion, block. It's just like, that's not going to work, right?
Yeah.
So finding that first step in humility, and it's hard because we have to take those steps ourselves often first, and then they can hopefully meet us and want to step into our world too.
Curiosity breeds compassion. That's what I'm thinking of when you're saying that.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
I mean, a lot of us don't approach these with genuine curiosity, which is the type that says the type that knows there's probably something that I am missing here, and I am curious because I want to learn more. Not I'm curious because I want to like find the information that will then just like confirm what I already think or believe. But it's a type of the humility that goes, I'm open to, and like that's not just like around political conversations. That's like, I need to have that type of curiosity with my wife, because there's a lot of times where I approach situations with her where I am exchanging binary thinking for binary thinking, and I'm not approaching her with curiosity that could help me have more compassion, because I'm already set in what I think and what I believe, and I'm trying to like force this connection, and there's not genuine curiosity on my part.
Yeah.
So you go through that with your wife too. It's not just.
Well, I've heard some clients talk about that. I'm mainly thinking of them, not.
Oh,
me.
gotcha. Okay.
Yeah,
You can understand it theoretically.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, theoretically. Yeah, there's this pastor in North Carolina I've quoted a few times. His name's Brian Laritz. He says that proximity breeds empathy, and he's, in the context I heard him talk about it, he was primarily talking about racial reconciliation, but I think it applies to story, to values. If you can have proximity to someone's story and what they value, then you can have empathy for why they value it. Like you're saying, and the backstory of Idaho gives you so much more empathy. But if I lived there, I would have way more empathy for the people of Idaho than I do as someone who looks from afar and says, how could you treat people you love like you treated Ben?
Yeah.
And I think that, to what you are saying, like, I know I have experienced, like, I feel like I'm recovering from being hyper reactive as I grow older and work through, especially after uncovering the wounds of trauma for myself. You uncover those wounds and suddenly you walk around more as an open wound for a while. And you
Yeah.
become hyper reactive to anybody who, in my case, I was abused by a youth pastor. I become hyper reactive to people in authority. And so like and that could be someone who is nothing like him, that doesn't have to be a youth pastor. There's times where I've been hyper reactive with my family in ways that I feel really sad and guilty about, even still. And it was out of this place of wanting to care for my own binary thinking without having any empathy for theirs.
Wow.
And I think hearing you talk about it, I'm like, man, I want to grow into a person who's so saturated in the gospel that it flows out of me the way it's flowing out of you.
Yeah.
That I'm as you're talking, I'm hearing that, and I'm like, I remember in grad school reading this book by a guy named Mark McMinn, who said the best way that you can be a therapist who is integrated in his faith is to be immersed in the gospel in your own life, because then it will flow out of you, whether it is intrinsically or extrinsically used in session. And the way you're talking, I'm like, yeah, man, that's how I feel it right now from you. It's like you're cloaked in the gospel, and it's just going to pour out of you in the way you talk. And if I can have that, then my reactions to my family will also be different. If I can have the humility that my thoughts are probably not the best ones to lead a non-binary thinking conversation with someone I disagree with, I'll probably be set up in a better position to begin with.
So
Gosh,
well
that
said.
is so well said. I think what you're highlighting so clearly is that like fear and power are often the dynamics behind that, right? Because like when we fear something, we want to control it, or we want to we want to have that power. We want to regain our power over that thing, right? And this may be a foreign concept to you guys, but have you heard of ACT?
Yeah.
My therapist is walking through ACT with me, of being able to understand like things that pop up, be curious about stuff in my own realm before I engage or be reactive, right? Because like, gosh, the binary thinking of my past is exactly what you're describing, is that I am prone to hyperreactivity, especially to those who are closest to me. But when we apply that on a collective scale, I mean, that's what we're seeing, is that we see fear and then the pursuit of power, right? We see that with the disciples and the gospel. Why was Jesus crucified? Because he threatened the status quo, the ways wealth and power were distributed, by trying to bring good news to the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed, to say, hey, they need stuff too. Like they should be included too. And we can do this differently. But those who benefit from the current status quo are not going to put up with that, right? They're going to either double down, or they're going to eliminate the threat to their wealth and power, those sorts of things. But I think on an individual level, we do the same thing as well, where when I operate in binary thinking, I do that. It's so wild because it exchanges faith for certainty, because there's two sides to the equation, right? And binary thinking claims that you know both sides completely, right? And so if you're on that wrong side that I claim to know and need no more questions asked, I can therefore reject you because I'm claiming to know everything already. That is not humility, right? And when you understand that complexity, I may not know everything already. There's more than one side. There's more than one angle to see this. We serve a cosmic, complex, beautiful God that made the diversity. I didn't even understand what atoms were until I graduated high school. Like, for crying out loud, there are things I don't know, especially about the complex, beautiful, complicated person right in front of me, and me too. So if we understand how important humility is, then we have to start letting go of that need to control, that need for power. And again, that's where the vulnerability of trust comes in. That is just so difficult to really step into, especially when we're afraid.
And I feel like we always come back to this, maybe because we're therapists, like one of the reasons why it is hard for you to let go of that control and surrender and have that vulnerability is likely because you were harmed in some way by somebody in a position of power. Like,
Yep.
if it comes down to
Yep.
fear and power, then we must be intimately aware and acquainted with the ways that we were harmed by power. And that's even like power in the family dynamic and the ways that our fear was mishandled or mistreated, because all that stuff is being triggered when we're having a conversation with somebody today who's a friend, but there's a subtle power dynamic in that friendship because of X, Y, or Z. And man, Ben, I'm just like so encouraged by the way, like, it's one thing to read your words and they're so like, it's just like truthful, and it like speaks directly to things that people kind of dance around, and it's so clear. And then to also be able to have a conversation with you in person and to get like to like experience your presence, like you have such a gift at balancing these conversations that can be really hard, also with a lot of grace and compassion, and not just like I don't know, a type of anger that could be even like hard to receive, which can sometimes be like some people can embody that too. So, and I think that just like shows the work that you've done too on your own story. And it really just, like Jamie was saying earlier, it really just flows out of you, and it's inspiring, and it's your words and like what I've read from you have been inspiring, the way that you can just name the truth of things, but your presence behind it is really what's more inspiring. So I don't know, I just wanted to say that because I'm aware of that right now.
I really appreciate that. I don't always, I think, again, it's the power of community. Like it feels, again, like I said at the beginning, it feels so rare to have humble conversations with humble people who are thirsting for curiosity and wanting to learn, not trying to dominate or control, but really seeking understanding, right? And that's where I'm working on myself still, that when like I get provoked online or somebody makes a huge reel about something that I wrote, and just, I mean, the Antichrist and demonic and like all of these things being said about what I feel like I was really trying to meet people, where they are, is just misinterpreted and like misrepresented and thrown out to an audience. I feel like I want to overthrow Rome. And that's where I have to catch myself and say, okay, put some distance there. Like, notice what's going on. And, when people send me private messages or whatever, I'm so tempted to be reactive and angry. And if I'm honest, there are times where I'll write things down and I fail. Like, I get really upset and I get defensive because they misunderstood. And then I get defensive right back, and I have to apologize. I have to come back and I have to say, look, that's not the person I want to show up as right then. But in today's world where like so many people have access to you, it's really crucial that we continue to live into that humility that you were describing. Like, that is always the goal, and then to admit when we don't reach that.
Yeah, we've said it before, and I want to keep talking to you all day. It's so energizing. But we've said it before, like the repair is so much more important than the rupture there. What you're modeling for everyone who follows you by following up on an apology when you've said something that you feel like is out of character is that not only am I human, but I'm humble enough to admit that I never intended to be Jesus. I just intended to be his hands and feet.
That's well said, man. I'm gonna steal that from you. That is so well said.
That's
never
good, Jamie.
intended to be the Savior, to be Jesus. Yeah, that's well said.
Yeah. Well, where can people find you, Ben, so that we can promote the heck out of you here?
Yeah, man. So Into the Gray, my newsletter, and you can see that at the top of all my social media platforms. And I'm on Facebook. Instagram is probably where I'm most active right now. I'm on Blue Sky and just recently got a Substack where you can sign up for 3% as well. They're really active there. But yeah, I think those are the places where you can find me the most.
Awesome. And we'll have all those in the show notes for everybody to go find you. So, man, we're so appreciative of your time and for who you are. And we'll do another one.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I hope we can talk again.
Yeah, absolutely, we will. And everybody, we're glad you're here. Keep coming back. You're worth it.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to another episode. Listen, we're working on some really practical resources to help you connect more deeply with yourself and others. So if you head over to our website, 3percentco.com, you can learn more about that. The link will be in the show notes. And this is the part of the show where we ask you for some help. Listen, we don't have a big fancy production team. We're recording these in my therapy office in between sessions and in the margins of our life. We just really believe in the message that much. I listen to a lot of podcasts, and rarely would I take the time to review and rate a show, just because honestly I forgot. It wasn't until we started doing this show that I realized doing that actually really does help these platforms notice our show and get the word out. And so if any of this is impactful to you, we would love it if you took a second to leave us a review, rate us, or if you want to just do it the old-fashioned way, text this link to a friend and say, hey, let's talk about this episode. Whatever you do, make sure to follow us on whatever platform you're listening to so you never miss an episode. We're really grateful you're here, and we'll see you next week.
So let's be honest, let's be honest.